Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me in the final session for this year's North American Voyager Council's Fall Gathering from Home. I'm Leif Halverson, and welcome to my session entitled Pursuing the Craft. You know, as living historians, as historical interpreters, as history volunteers at the different sites that mean so much to us, we've got different reasons why we delve into history the way that we do, the way that we pore over fur trade journals and ledgers, learning about the material culture of the time, researching the clothing that we wear, and picking up new skill sets, learning how to make things in a historic fashion, and combining all of that together and going on some of these different epic history voyages that we get to go on. And for some of us, myself included, it's for the wide-eyed, childlike wonderment that we get to experience when we do these things. These different aha moments where we get a glimpse into the past for 5 seconds to exist someplace, to understand the why this thing was made the way it was. Understand why that was mentioned in that fur trade journal the way it was. Why this thing was fabricated the way that it was. You know, as we do all of those things, as we pursue the craft, it makes us better historians and interpreters and volunteers. And to do that, you know, we can get doggone frustrated sometimes. This is not always an easy thing for us to do. And we run into roadblocks, we run into snags, and it can be frustrating, and sometimes we just throw projects off to the side and we don't want to have anything to do with it anymore because we just don't know what to do with it because we are so frustrated. But just, it's all right. It's going to be okay. You just need to give yourself permission to do 3 things as we continue pursuing the craft. And these 3 things come from one of the best doggone science teachers we've ever seen, a gal by the name of Miss Frizzle. Yes, that's a reference to the Magic School Bus. You got to be willing to give yourself permission to take chances, to make mistakes, and to get messy. And that's what we're going to learn about now. As I said before, my name is Leif Halverson. I'm nobody special. There is nothing special about me. I'm just your ordinary, boring guy. If you know who I am, it's possible that you've met me at Grand Portage. I'm in that music group, a newer one that's been at Grand Portage the past couple of years anyway, called Eric and Artie of the Upper Missouri. You may be familiar with me from my antics of what I get to do as a interpreter at Fort Union Trading Post National Historic Site. I'm one of the summer seasonal rangers there. I've been there for the past 8 seasons. My first season I was there under the Teacher Ranger Teacher Program. At the completion of my time there, our then superintendent Andy Banta said, "Hey, would you be interested in applying to be a summer seasonal ranger?" And I said, "Heck yeah." And I've been there for the next 7 seasons after that. What you probably don't know about me is that when I'm not doing that, I'm a teacher. I'm not a history teacher, though. I'm an elementary teacher. I'm an elementary music teacher, which is why you're seeing what you're seeing behind me, because this is teaching, and so I'm in my classroom because that's where I should be while I'm doing things like this. This is a story that starts in the year 2018. Lots of wide-eye wonderment, lots of amazing experiences, how that brought on different projects, and how I'm just going to have to be satisfied with being frustrated here in the year 2021. But along with that is some encouragement, and some encouragement for all of us as well. An epic voyage. As I said, Fort Union Trading Post National Historic Site in the summertime is where I work as a interp ranger. I talk about the history of the fur trade on the Upper Missouri. Fort Union gets built in 1828, gets shut down in 1867. 39 years of existence that it was in operation. It's one of the longest lasting fur trading posts in America, believe it or not. It was the shining beacon of the Upper Missouri outfit of the American Fur Company. The way that all of the supplies and the men originally got there was via keelboat. In 1832, finally the first steamboat arrives, but even after it does not antiquate the keelboats. What ends up happening is Fort Union's as far west as those steamboats can go. And so Fort Union gets used as a supply depot for the further west fur trading posts in the area that belong to the American Fur Company. Fort Pegan, Fort McKenzie further into western Montana, and Fort Cass, places like that. So all of the goods get dumped at Fort Union. After the steamboat goes back, these keelboats are then loaded up with all the supplies and taken upstream to outfit those smaller American Fur Company trading posts. So it's still in use even after the steamboat comes into play. This is part of the history that I get to share with people. And I'm sure, like a lot of you, I get to geek out on that stuff. If I can talk to people who come and want to know about history and they just ask question after question, I'm going to do my darndest to give them all the answers that I can. And understanding about the river travel, that's one of those things that I get to do. In the year 2018, I got to go on an epic voyage. I got to go on a 5-day keelboat trip on a reproduction keelboat, about 2/3 scale, 33 feet in length, called the General William Ashley, that is owned and operated and captained by Mr. Mike Nottingham, a fellow American mountain man brother, an amazing guy who understands how the river works and is in complete control of his vessel, the General William Ashley. 5 days. Up in the area of present-day Fort Benton, Montana, we put in at Virgil Ferry and came out about 50 river miles later at the Judith crossing, so to speak, where the Judith flows in to the Missouri River. 5 days, 50 miles that we got to do on that. What made me really excited about that trip is, number one, it's just not every day you can go and do that. Number two, I got to do it with people that I knew for the most part, fellow historians, fellow living historians. My brother Cedric was there, my friend Sawyer Flynn, another fellow interpreter from Fort Union at the time. Our friend Neil Jones put this whole thing together. Our friend Mark Brown was on the trip as well, and some of the other guys that I've gotten to experience living history with, working together to inform the public about history. Ended up being 11 of us on this keelboat. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, but I was excited to be able to have a better understanding of how river travel worked from the basis of what I get to do with people when they come and visit me in the trade house at Fort Union. I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, except for adventure, and we had some. Of course, just us being us and being geeks and things like that, the goal was to be as historically accurate as possible, giving ourselves a time frame of 1800 to 1840. Keelboats are being used during that time frame. For me, as a interpreter, I'm thinking the year 1833 in particular, because I know on that year when Prince Maximilian and Karl Bodmer and a guy by the name of Dreidel Hoppel or Doppelganger or whatever the heck his name is, who was the third German that was with him, visit Fort Union in 1833, they board a keelboat named the Flora, which is headed to Fort Pegan, Fort McKenzie, which is in the area where our keelboat trip was taking place. So to me, I'm experiencing the year 1833. So we've got our gear, we've got our clothing, and we set off from Virgil Ferry outside a ways from Fort Benton, Montana. And we begin the first day of the voyage. Now there's a variety of ways historically that keelboats are navigated, the river systems that they're being used on. And we got to experience most of them, but not all of them. Your common ways that keelboats are actually piloted, moved through the water. We think of canoes. I think we're all used to that, using paddles. Well, they had those on keelboats as well. It kind of depended on how large the vessel was. Some of the larger keelboats, unlike ours was about the General William Ashley, our keelboat was about 33 feet in length. Some of the keelboats are up to 70 feet in length, sometimes 80. Some of these were getting to be pretty doggone big size boats. So oars, paddles are being used sometimes at the front, sometimes at the back, sometimes at the front and the back. At the rear of the vessel, oftentimes a tiller or a different paddle is used for steering. On those longer ones, sometimes they'd have one at the bow and at the stern to help swing the vessel more efficiently. depending on how the bends were in the river, as they're keeping an eye out for things like sandbars because they don't want to get high centered on those. We see sometimes, like in Prince Maximilian's journal, as I was reading through that, sometimes it's taking the better part of a day for them to get unstuck and finally get moving back on down the river. So you've got the use of paddles or oars. That's one way that they're going to propel it. Another way, and this one you're probably going to be able to remember from the Corps of Discovery's journey, and by the way, that was a barge-style keelboat, not an actual keelboat, but that's a whole other thing that we don't need to get into tonight. Using those setting poles where long poles, they'd set it down, they'd push, and they'd walk across the deck of the keelboat to propel the boat forward. That was another methodology that they would use. Then we've got cordelling. Cordelling is backbreaking work. Cordelling is where you take a very long rope, about half of your crew or so, depending on how many that you've got, are actually in the water or on the bank pulling on a larger keelboat 1,000-foot long rope. You know, that's longer than 3 football fields. That's how long this rope is. Going through the water sometimes it's on the bank, sometimes it's high on the bank, which leads to some different dangers. For example, one of the top ways that keelboats got destroyed, got wrecked, was on the side of the river where it was essentially a tall wall with a drop-off. Because of erosion and things, and sometimes from the men being up there because that was the best option that they had, part of that wall on the side of the bank breaking and falling down and crushing the keelboat. In 1832, when Hamilton was taking a group out to Fort Piegan, Fort Mackenzie, that's exactly what happened. And this makes a huge cacophony of sound that you can hear for quite a while. One day while I was working in the trade house at Fort Union, I heard this horrendous, massive splashing sound, had no idea what it was. I hightailed it out of the trade room, ran into the courtyard, ran up the stairs so that I could go up onto the palisade wall, and I looked over the river and I could see dust in the air from where a huge chunk of the bank, of this tall drop-off side of the bank, had fallen off into the river. And as I watched, seeing dust, and this is 1.5 miles or so away on the other side of the river that I'm seeing from the fort wall, I watch as a cottonwood tree begins to lean over, and eventually the entire thing goes over. Big, massive splash and dust in the air. Seeing that, hearing that cacophony of sound, as I'm reading, learning about what these guys are experiencing, that's what that moment would have been like. It just this huge thing that you just don't see happen. We read about it, but that was one of the top ways they would end up losing keelboats. Another way was them getting grounded on the sandbars. Sometimes storms would come up and cause all kind of issues as well too. So back to our cordelling line. That's one of the ways that they're doing that. They're actually pulling the keelboat. Usually this is going to be upstream. This is going to be against stream. This is one of the main ways that it's happening, unfortunately. So pulling it while on shore. Now, if life was incredibly terrible and they couldn't get a good footing on anything, and it was just the brush was too thick for them to bushwhack through to actually be able to pull the vessel up, what they would do is they would send a group of guys up, go around a bend or whatever, tie that rope off onto something, and then on the deck, standing on the deck, they would pull the keelboat that way, coiling up the rope on the deck as they were going. That was when life was extremely terrible. All right, so we've got the use of the oars. We have got the use of the setting poles. We've got the use of that cordell line, those longer ones, 1,000 feet long, 20 some odd guys sometimes pulling on those things. But there was a fourth option as well that oftentimes was used in conjunction with the cordelling line while they're going upstream, and that was the use of a sail. Now, as I am learning about this, I'm reading through a fur trade book, obviously, written by a guy by the name of Hiram Chittenden. Now, those of you who have read Chittenden know that it can be a bit of a grind. His history of the fur trade of the far west, Volume 2 is like just flora and fauna, and it's a grind, and you kind of wonder if Chittenden just doesn't hate his life, and you definitely pick up on the fact that he's not a huge fan of the American Fur Company. Boo, but that's all right. He ends up writing two other books that get combined together, and you'll understand why they were two separate titles to begin with before they get joined together. A book in its entirety, both volumes together, called History of Early Steamboat Navigation on the Missouri River, Life and Adventures of Joseph LaBarge, Pioneer Navigator and Indian Trader for 50 years, identified with the commerce of the Missouri Valley. There's a reason why this was originally two books. I'm finding out about river navigation, I'm reading about keelboats in here, and I'm scared that this is going to be just a grind. It actually seems like he enjoyed writing this book. So I'm learning all kinds of interesting things, and he tells me in here that the sails that they would use were about 100 square feet. This is going to come into play. This ends up inspiring me to take on a project after I get back from this keelboat trip. We didn't have a sail with us. Oftentimes what would happen, they've got the men cordelling, they'd have the sail up if they could, because as they would take the different bends, they could catch the wind enough that would help propel the boat forward, and then as they turned again, then they got to completely rely on the cordel line. They utilized that sail as often as they could. Now on our trip, when we took off from Virgil Ferry, where we're going to come out at the Judith Landing, 50 miles away from the upper Missouri River breaks, we didn't get to do that. We did do cordelling. We did get to use the oars. I got to run on the tiller on the back. That was how we navigated the boat. Now, while we didn't have the sail, I have to speak to the prowess of Captain Mike Nottingham. And my buddy Neil Jones, he's the one who put this whole trip together. He's the one that pointed this out. So we're taking turns on the tiller, we're taking turns on the oars while we're going down the river. A wind came up, and Neil noticed that when that happened, this happened multiple times, Captain Mike, who was on the tiller, instead of having us going, completely parallel within the river channel, would actually get the keelboat steered off center so that the wind was blowing on the cab and helping pushing it down. That's a guy who spent a lot of time on the river, who understands his craft. And I've got to imagine that if their sails got wrecked, which ends up happening on the keelboat, the Flora, I got to imagine that the keelboat captains of that time are doing something similar, whatever they can to help give their men an edge like that, to be able to go further downstream so it's not as much backbreaking work. First night, we stop at a place called Monroe Island. And this is where I have one of those childlike, wide-eyed wonderment moments that we as living historians live for, these moments. We put in on Monroe Island. There's about a 20-foot wide channel on the other side of it, which is next to this high bank behind us. And we've got everything pulled onto shore. And like the men that we're trying to emulate and experience, we end up taking turns on guard duty, right? This isn't an area historically where the Gros Ventre would be, where the Blackfoot would be. You'd be keeping your eyes open for that, right? Any kind of nincompoop, we want to make sure that things are taken care of, because we've got to get all this stuff back down to Fort Union so that it can be sent down to St. Louis. So that night I'm on guard duty. And if I'm remembering correctly, I was on guard duty from about midnight to 1 a.m. We all took turns. Someone came and woke me up at midnight. I went on patrol. And I have got my Northwest trade gun with me, which is not loaded at this particular point, but I'm on guard duty. I'm keeping an eye on things. And one of the first things that I did was I tried to orient myself right away. I'm not looking at the dimly lit campfire that's there anymore. I'm looking at the stars. I find the Big Dipper, line up the two outline edge. All right, there's Polaris, that's the North Star. I now know which way north is. I'm oriented. I'm feeling pretty good grounded as to where I am and everything. And I slowly make my way around this small Monroe Island that we are camped on. I can hear the sound of the water lapping up against the edge of the General William Ashley that we've got secured. So it's not going to take off on us in the middle of the night. I'm hearing the sounds of the breeze going through the trees and everything. and the stars are out. It's a pretty night. What I don't realize is as time goes on, I start migrating more to the shadows and staying more in the shadows. And the point comes where I'm starting to get concerned. I am worried about Blackfeet or Gros Ventre jumping us in the night. And I am looking around from the shadows as I'm lurking from place to place going, that would be a logical ambush location that someone could come from. And I am formulating in my mind how I'm going to wake up the camp if I need to. After about, I don't know, what seemed like 10 minutes of this, I say out loud to myself, Leif, no one's coming. But for like 10 minutes, I was living in 1833, the sights, the smells, the sounds that were all around me. I was in that mindset. I was making sure, I was concerned. I'm looking for any kind of possible thing. I was positive that Blackfoot or Nez Perce were keeping their eyes out, or sorry, Gros Ventre were keeping their eyes out for us, and we might get ambushed in the middle of the night. I was there for like 10 minutes, which is an incredibly long time. And you don't get to experience those moments like that unless you go and do a trip like that with friends like that. My time is done. I think my brother was the next one. I wake Cedric up and he takes over. I go to sleep, crawl in my bedroll. All of a sudden, we're all woken up. This is about 3:30 in the morning to this massive sound coming from that channel behind the island, Monroe Island, that we were on. And I bolt up. I've got the Northwest trade gun in hand. I'm looking around to figure out what's going on. I'm noticing that the other guys in our party are doing the same thing. And what happened was this massive sound was a squadron of pelicans. Yes, that's actually what it's called, is a freaking squadron, by the way, was in that side channel. And what had happened was a couple of coyotes had gotten on to the eastern edge of the island and had spooked them. And because of how big these stupid birds are and how wide their wingspan is, they are flapping and trying to run on the water as hard as they can. And I happen to catch the tail end where they're finally starting to take flight and take off down. But everyone was like, boom, onto their knees. Flintlocks were grabbed, assessing the situation, figuring out what we had to do. We were in the moment again. That was 2 times in that night where I was there in 1833, these moments that we live for. And that was night number 1. Now, as we continue going on down this journey, we would stop at some of the different Corps of Discovery camps. And the Montana Bureau of Land Management has done a great job of identifying these campsites. And they've put, you're going to see some images right here, concrete with a brass placard on top that even gives the date of when they were there. We got to stop at some of those spots. We got to see some petroglyphs on the wall that may have been there during the time where they were in the area. We got to see some of those different sites. I got to collect sage, which I brought home with me from some of those campsites, which is pretty, for me anyway, is pretty cool. Got to see those. Got to take turns doing the different aspects of the cordelling, of doing the rowing, of running the tiller on the back. We even got to experience some of the not so fun stuff as well, which is what we wanted to do. We wanted to experience those things. The heat, the weather. Depending on your clothing, you can still get sunburn even though you're all covered up. I was wearing a lighter linen shirt, and my shoulders ended up getting roasted pretty doggone good. So dealing with those things, and a lot of times if those men were in the water, when they were doing the cordelling, Prince Maximilian talks about how the men strip down, they're in their waist into the mud and the muck, pulling, they're just exposed to the heat and everything, and talks about how they're laughing, and you're kind of reminded of what we're familiar with the Voyagers doing in the canoes with the joking and the laughing and the singing and all of that. These men are doing that too on this keelboat, the Flora, in 1833. So we're getting exposed to those things. Prince Maximilian talks about how they've got the sail out, and all of a sudden a storm comes up and it blows them, keeps on blowing them off course, and they're watching just the majesty of this massive storm opening up in front of them, and then out of nowhere, because of how hard it suddenly hits even more and intensifies, blows the ship off course and just rips the ever-loving dickens out of the keelboat sail. Well, do they fix it? Well, I'm going to let you read Volume 2 of Prince Maximilian to find out if they actually do that or not. We end up going through a torrential downpour. This is on night 3. This is our second to last night that we're camping. And we are on a bank. We're not under a bunch of trees or anything like that. I call it burrito wrapping. I've got a ground cloth and I've got my bedding on there, and then I throw the other part on top of me just to help keep everything nice in case we've got weather or anything. Wake up in the middle of the night and there's a little bit of a drizzle, a little bit of a sprinkle going on, which I don't mind. Who doesn't like the sound of, when we're in camps, a nice soft rain dripping down on the canvas that we've got, right? It's kind of a soothing sound, so I drift back off to sleep. I wake up a little while later and it's raining harder. I drift off to sleep. I wake up again, it's even harder. Wake up a little while later and we've got a dadgum downpour. I reach up to pull all of the bedding over so I can look out, and I notice everyone else is kind of shifting in their spots as well too. My ground cloth, the part that's over the top of me made out of Russia sheeting, is completely soaked through, and the top of the buffalo robe, the hair side, is down on me. I had just finished brain tanning this thing. The leather part is completely saturated. There is so much weight. It feels like I've got 20 pounds on top of me because the leather is saturated, but I am dry. And so we wait it out, and we wake up the next morning and we have to dry out absolutely everything. Now you might be thinking, why didn't you guys just stay in the cabin part? Well, our Captain Mike did stay in there. But keep in mind, historically, that cabin would have been predominantly filled with all of the trade goods and supplies that are being taken to those different fur trading posts that they're outfitting. So that wouldn't have been a place that most of the men would have been able to stay in during a storm. Staying on the bank makes the most sense. Not all the places that they would have been staying would have had some kind of cover. Sometimes you're just completely exposed, in as far as being able to be under trees or anything like that is just not an option. You're kind of on a plains area, so you're just camped out on the bank out in the open. And that's exactly what happened to us. So the next day we had to spend our time getting everything dried out, hanging things on, we had drying lines set up. It got so boggy to get down to the keelboat. Some of us are taking off our moccasins and pulling, rolling our pant legs up as we're kind of wading around in this quagmire of stuff that's been created because of this torrential downpour all night long. One of the things that we end up doing, I think it was Daniel Lim, he's a teacher as well in Idaho, who's on the trip with us, started taking all this grass that we've got and cutting a bunch of it and basically making this kind of a grass mat path walkway down to the keelboat, just so that we're just not sinking into all this mud which is there now. This is a thing that these guys would have been up against. They wouldn't, I don't know if they ended up doing something like that as a means of contending with the issue, but this would have been a problem that these guys would have had to face. One of the ways that the men on these keelboat journeys were able to eat, they obviously brought some rations with them, and obviously they were bringing stuff to the trading post that they were going to. There's only so much of that you can break into, obviously, because that's how you're outfitting that post. So continual hunting, just like at a trading post, is going to be taking place. They were doing that on this trip as well. Hunters are being sent out. Now, we see in the case of the Flora in 1833, Prince Maximilian talks about a small boat and he talks about a dinghy. And in my reading of that, I haven't seen where they're both coexisting at the same time. I think he's going back and forth, just using those two terms, referring to the same small boat, like a rowboat basically, that's apparently going with them. And the hunters are going out. Sometimes Mr. Culbertson is going out and that as well too. But the hunters are going out. They're getting and hunting wild game. Now, we got to enjoy some of those different options as well, things that we brought with us. Mark Brown, who's a good friend of mine who was on the trip as well. He's a living historian. We've gotten to do some pretty incredible things with each other. Mark is a taxidermist, and so people will bring in sometimes full animals, and he'll say, do you want the meat? You know, aside from the taxidermy work that he's done, and a lot of times people are like, no, we're not interested in the meat, just, you know, do the thing up for us. So what Mark will do is he'll save that meat, he'll freeze it, he'll can it or whatever. As a result of all the taxidermy work that he did, we got to try a variety of wild game, including stuff that you wouldn't normally think of. We got to try bear, we got to try elk, we got to try buffalo, we got to try deer venison, and we got to try mountain lion. 5 different types of meat while we were on that trip. Mountain lion, what in the heck? I know, I was a bit dodgy at first when I first, was looking at this as an option. But let me tell you, I love mountain lion meat, and I would have never had the opportunity to try it were it not for this trip. If it was something that was in the area, they needed to defend themselves. In this case, of a mountain lion and you shot one, and you don't have other food, well, why not? Mountain lion, depending on how you cook it, tastes quite similar to pork and has a similar texture to it as well. I've also noticed it's got both light and dark meat. I like mountain lion, and I got to try that on that trip along with those other wild game while we were on there, getting to experience those things in a similar fashion to those men that were on those historic trips. As we talked about, sometimes keelboats met with demise. Fortunately not the Flora on that trip in 1833, but in 1832 that we talked about, the keelboat that went out there that Hamilton was with that year before did come to its untimely demise. Or it did get wrecked, where the bank collapsed and crushed it. They end up finding some of the cargo that was on it in 1833 while they're on the Flora. They come across a keg of powder and a keg of tobacco, if I'm remembering correctly. So sometimes those things would get lost. It would get lost to the river. And my brother Cedric and I would experience that as well too on this trip, but in a slightly different fashion. We made it safely to the end. We made it safely to where the Judith flows in to the Missouri. And it was an amazing time. Along with us, okay, it was kind of a luxury item, but Cedric brought with him his 3/4 scale parlor guitar, and I had along with me my minstrel banjo, a reproduction from the year 1848 made by William Boucher, originally. Our last night at the camp that we called the Corps of Recovery Camp, because we were all pretty wore out at that point, we played music. We did a couple other nights as well too, but we played historic music and we had a good time. So we were really glad that we had our instruments with us. We get to the end. We end up driving to Great Falls, where we come to find out later that next day is the minstrel banjo theft capital of Montana. What happened was we go and we stay at a hotel. So we're going to check out the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center. And so we do that the next day. But we wake up and happen to look out the window and notice that the tailgate is down on my truck. Cedric and I go out. Both the guitar and the minstrel banjo are gone. It was stolen. Probably not by the Gros-Ventre or the Blackfoot. Probably some tweaker. So if you're ever in Great Falls, don't stay at the Holiday Inn Express with the water slide, stay at the other one, because if you've got a minstrel banjo, that's where yours is going to be stolen. Now, fortunately, the Great Falls Police Department did a wonderful job, and you're going to see some images pop up here. They did find it. They mailed it back to me. And Cedric and I was freaking out because we were actually going to be doing music at Grand Portage in the Great Hall, and we had to have our instruments. They were able to find the banjo. They mailed it back to me. Cedric's guitar they weren't able to recover, but it worked out. He's actually playing on a much nicer Martin guitar now. And this banjo lives in my classroom now that I get to use to help teach my kids about historic music. So not quite the same thing as the stuff being stolen by the Gros-Ventre or the Blackfoot, but we as well did experience the loss of goods on the trip. So now it's present day. all of these wonderful things has taken place, I got to experience some amazing wide-eyed moments in 2018 on the keelboat trip. I'm at Fort Union. It's the summertime. I'm interpreting things. And I always have a list of projects that I'm going to try to do. Inspired by the trip and additional reading that I was doing, in particular reading about Prince Maximilian's trip while he was at Fort Union, and I'm reading about the keelboat flora, I get inspired based upon the reading, along with experiences from Grand Portage. John Hayes had done a presentation while we were there on sails and sail making, and Cedric and I watched that and took a bunch of pictures of all the work that he'd done on the sail that he had fabricated. And so I'm learning about these different things, and I say to my supervisor, Lisa Sandin, I'm going to make a keelboat sail, and she's like, all right, because that's what she does anymore when I tell her I'm going to come up with some kind of a harebrained scheme. And so that's what I do. I'm still researching and learning about the lives of these men. I'm pursuing this craft of the keelboatmen so that I can better explain to the public about what life was like for them. So I start picking up different skills, learning different things that they more than likely would have had. I know that the keelboat sail gets wrecked in one of those storms. Again, you're going to have to read and find out if they had another one, if they replaced it, if they fixed it. This is an inspiration for me as to why I should know how to do these things, to do canvas work and repair. So I start delving into that. I take on a couple different projects that's leading up to working on this keelboat sail. Rope work and knot work is an important thing for anyone who's spending time on a riverboat of any kind during the time of the fur trade. You're fastening things down, you're securing the vessel to the dock, at places where your fur trading posts at. In the case of keelboats, being able to secure it to the side, they've got masts and rigging, rope that needs to be maintained. So being able to work with ropes is one of those important things. Not to mention ropes being used for all kinds of things. In our case, it's going to be hemp rope. In fact, in 1831, Kenneth Mackenzie, former Northwest Company employee, 1821, the merger between Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company and the HBC, thumbs his nose at him and says, look, you'll never make it, nuts to you, you don't get to be a part of this crew. And he goes, joke's on you guys, I'm going to start the Columbia Fur Company and I'm going to rock the socks off the upper Missouri, and then I'm going to get bought out by the American Fur Company and be the first bourgeois at Fort Union Trading Post. He mentions in the 1831 invoice, he says, look, stop sending us cotton rope, send us hemp rope, because when the cotton rope wears out, and this is being used on the boats and it's being used at the post as well, he says, the cotton rope is worthless once it wears out, but the hemp rope, we can use that for well, it's a bummer I don't remember what the word is. But basically what it's being used for, it's being used in between the boards of the buildings, stuck in between to block the wind and the chinking and mortarings going on the outside of that. They're also using that hemp rope for repair work on the boats where the different boards come together. They're taking special chisels and they're kind of unwinding that hempen fiber, putting it on top of that seam and tapping it down in between the boards. They'll do several layers of this combined with tarring to seal that up and to make the boat watertight. So hemp rope is obviously one of the things that we're going to use. So whether it's on the boat or it's off the boat, if you're a river boatman, you got to be able to do some stuff. You've got to be able to heave lines back and forth from the vessel to shore or from the shore to the vessel. And using a special one called a heaving line, you'll toss it from one direction to the other. On the end, you'll tie a heavier line, maybe to tie down the vessel at a dock, if you're at a trading post. And so a heaving line made sense that this is one of the things that I should make and know how to use. So that's what I did. There's an outfit called the Artful Sailor, and they actually sold a heaving line kit. Now, the rope used is hempex, not actual hemp, but as an analog with what I'm able to show with the public, that worked out fine. And basically what a simple heaving line is at the end we've got this special knot called a monkey's fist, which sometimes has a weight in there, sometimes there's a piece of wood. Mine does have a piece of wood, so you do this special knot work. And then I do what's called seizing, right in through here in this spot here. I have this seized together. Think of like instead of lashing wood together, you're lashing rope together. That's what's going on here. This has got tarred marlin on it. So it's basically pine tar that's impregnated into that fiber to help protect it against the water. At the other end, this has been spliced together with more of the tarred marlin on the end to keep it from wearing. This will be used to be tossed from the vessel to the shore so that a heavier line can go. So that was one of the things that I learned how to do, was to put together this heaving line, which then I was able to use for some special children's programming that was taking place during our annual rendezvous at Fort Union. So sewing. Sewing is another thing that a good riverboatman is going to have to know how to do. I guess he doesn't have to, but he's going to be a lot better off if he can. And this made sense to me. Repair work with canvas, the hemp linen sails, the cover on the cargoes, your clothing getting wrecked, things like that. So assembling a set of tools, learning how to do those different stitches and everything, made sense that this is part of pursuing the craft of these riverboatmen. So that's what I did. Now, there's a wonderful book that was suggested to me. My friend Mark Scott, you might know him. He suggested this book to me, The Arts of the Sailor. You'll notice that there's a heaving line that's on here. And in here, it talks about how to make what gets referred to as a ditty bag. And a ditty bag can get used for a variety of things. It's similar to a sea bag, although a sea bag oftentimes is bigger. You keep your clothing and other stuff in it. A ditty bag is typically smaller, and that's where you're keeping all of your sailor tools in. So that was a project that I took on next. I made it out of Russia sheeting. Again, a very common fabric from the time frame. It's very hardy. It's like Carhartt on crack, basically. Unlike cotton duck, you know, you can put a nick and you can just rip that in half. Not so much with Russia sheeting. So that's what I used. And basically what it is a giant rectangle with a circle sewn on the bottom. It's got eyelets. These eyelets I had to hand make. I took hemp cordage and made myself a grommet and then had to hand stitch it all on there. We learned the different stitchings that is common to sail making and sail repair that goes along the edge. We see how we've got the double going on the main seam there. And this is another way that you are practicing your craft of this canvas, working with canvas. And your sail repair and maintenance in the making of this ditty bag. Also, you're doing different fancified knot work things. And in historic examples that we see, they're not all fancy like this, but this was the way that it was suggested in the Arts of the Sailor. So that's what I did as a starting point. I've got my loop on top. I've got the handle here, and then a Turk's head, which gets used to close that all together. A lot of times these would be varnished to keep them solid so that they slide up and down. Now the problem was I had access to what Amazon called cotton macrame cord. Don't use that. That's a terrible idea because it's so stretchy. When I've got my ditty bag closed, I have to loop it like this so that I don't have a handle that's like 15 feet long. Is what it is. But I learned from it. And I was learning the skill set of what these guys did, using the tools that they used as well too. So I started assembling all of these tools, which I kept in my ditty bag so that I could work on making that historic keelboat sail, 100 square feet, although what I had was slightly less than that, but we're just going to make it work because we'll still be able to convey those things to the public anyway. So I start putting all these things together. On my wood lathe, I make myself a fid. This is used for separating the larger pieces on larger rope while you are splicing them together. Here's another one that I got from Mark Scott. You don't have an iron with you while you're on a keelboat. You use a seam rubber. Basically, it's a flat piece like this. You fold over your fabric and then you rub it back and forth by friction. It's a seam rubber. You use it to rub the seam. But this is also a way where you can fold your fabric, create that crease so that you can do the sewing that you need. Basically, it's a poor man's iron. So I had to have one of those. You've got a smaller version of the FID, we've got what's called the marlin spike. This is made out of metal. This is for working with smaller pieces of or thinner diameter rope. This is based upon historic ones from the time frame in the 17 and 1800s, made by one of our RV volunteer in parks folks, Tom Hartley, who's no stranger to Grand Portage. Him and his wife Karen, if you were there several years ago, you might have been the recipient of one of Karen's woven sashes that she gave out at Grand Portage. She made one for me this year too. So Tom and Karen, I hope you guys are doing awesome where you're at now. And Tom, thanks again for making this for me. This is a part of my permanent kit that is always with my river stuff. It's always in my ditty bag. Marlin spike, you're going to want to have one of those. Needles, the sewing needles, the sailmaker's needles are like large Glover's needles. They're triangular on the end, but what separates them from a Glover's needle is that the edges aren't sharp, because you want to separate the fibers. You don't want to cut them. Now, to be able to sew though, we've got to have another tool, and this one is very important. It's called a palm. And what the palm is it's basically a thimble for your hand. There's your thimble in the middle. You've got your sailing twine that goes in the end of your sailing needle. You're going to hold that with your index and thumb, and the back end where the eye is going to go right into your the thimble that's in the middle there. This is a seaming palm for sewing on seams. They've got a roping palm as well, which is similar for sewing the bolt rope around the edge of the sail. That bolt rope provides the skeleton that it hangs on. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my seam. I'm able to start it, and I'm able to push it in and then pull it out. So a seaming palm, that's another tool that you're going to need to have. To keep your needles, sometimes you've got a needle safe. I've got one of those, but also they had needle horns. So this is made out of cow horn, and this is cod line that's on there. The inside was filled with wax, and what you would do is you would take all of your needles and they would just stick right down into the wax. So you could hang this. If you were on shore, they would have these sail makers benches where a bunch of these guys would sit down as they're sewing. Their needles would be in these sewing horn or these needle horns, or they'd have them in their needle safes, and would sit on the bench next to them. They could have all their tools sitting right next to them. So this is another tool that you end up having. We haven't even talked about the different kinds of threads yet. We've got all kinds of linen. We've got thin. We've got not as thin that has been waxed. This is hemp stuff. Hemp sail twine, sometimes it's referred to. This is what I was using to sew on that on the keelboat sail. We've got thinner tarred marlin. We've got thicker tarred marlin. We've got other hempen cordage. We've got all kinds of threads going on here. And then we've got one final tool that's essential as well too, and it's what's called a sail maker's hook, which looks like this. The end gets fastened to the end of the table that you're sewing at, or the end of the bench that you're sitting at. And they had small collapsible ones. I don't know if they'd have been brought on a keelboat or not, but they had small collapsible ones. The end was attached to the side, and it's essentially a third hand with whatever you're sewing on. The sail hook goes in and holds to the fabric, provides tension so that you can hold the other end, and then with your seaming palm you can do your sewing. Once you sew so far, you readjust it so that you can just keep on moving down the line. So that was one of the next things that I did, learning how to do these stitches, making the ditty bag. I've got a historic object that they would have had where I can put all my tools on the inside to keep it all together. So things are progressing well. I'm learning how to sew a sail. I'm sewing it together. Some issues start coming up though. I come to find out that the sailcloth at the time typically was 24 inches wide. The width of the fabric that I'm using is 58-60 inches wide. So I cut those panels in half. So I've got 4 panels that are 28 to 30 inches wide. And since there's no selvage edge, I have to put an additional fold. And I do the wrong kind of stitching when I sewed the first 2 original panels together. Crap. So I begin to adjust. when I'm sewing two more of the panels together. That one ends up being half right and half wrong. And then I get to the final one where I've laid it out on the table in the clerk's office. I've taken the seam rubber, I've done all of my hand ironing on it, and I'm stitching it together exactly the right way. And I'm feeling really good about life. I'm looking forward to the fact that I'm going to get to start sewing that bolt rope on in several weeks' time, probably, as long as I can keep up with the pace that I'm working on this. I'm learning how I'm going to be doing the wrapping of the rope at the ends, where we end up having these eyelets to secure the bottom of the sail as it's sailing. And I'm looking at all the compromise that I've made at this point, and I get another blow to the whole process of things just not quite being right. I'm looking at images online. Karl Bodmer, German artist, he's with Prince Maximilian in 1833. Remember, I'm jonesing on the Flora. The Flora is my inspiration. We've even got the list of the 50-some-odd people that are on that keelboat. The names of men that I'm trying to emulate as I'm pursuing the craft of the river of the keelboatman. And I find an image that Karl Bodmer leaves us. It's of the Flora as they are outside the Grove on camp. And here's what it looks like. And I say out loud, "Oh, you sexy, sexy thing." And then I realize I'm in the basement of the visitor center, and my supervisor goes, "What?" And I realize I'm potentially facing an EEO complaint. And then I explain what I'm talking about, and she's like, "Oh, okay." And she's fine with that. And I'm so excited because I actually have an image now of what the Flora looked like, of what the sail looked like. And my heart drops as I realize, now look at the sail on that. Chittenden, that is way the heck bigger than 100 square feet. That is way the heck bigger than 10 foot by 10 foot. And now I am not sure what to do. Because I've invested all this time, I've invested all this research, all of this energy. I've spent hundreds of dollars on hemp linen. I'm taking chances. I'm making all kinds of mistakes. I am making an absolute mess of things. And it's going to be wrong. And it's frustrating. It's going to be like $1,200 to have the amount of fabric that I'm seeing in this image of the Flora. And the end of the season came. And then school started. I'm teaching at school again. And this is the most frustrating school year of the entirety of my teaching career. And it's sad. I've done some sewing. It's not going to be the right size. The panels aren't going to be the right width. They don't have selvage edges. The hemp cordage that I have, the hemp rope, which it's piled next to me right over here right now, it should be soaked in that pine tar. I've got the pine tar. That hasn't happened yet. And I feel like it's all a waste. I feel so incredibly frustrated. I don't know what to do with it. But I had to turn on the teaching brain. And I had to talk to myself the way I would talk to one of the young people that I'm responsible for teaching. And I looked at the whole situation, and I went, you're going to finish this sail, Leif, and it's going to be not right, but you're still going to be able to use it as an interpretive tool for the public, and you're still going to be able to show them, give them a basis of an idea that they didn't before, and you'll be able to tell them everything that's wrong, but you're going to be able to show them everything that's right. But it's far bigger than this sail. Along the way, I made a heaving line. I got used to working with the rope work more. I got pretty proficient with the different types of nautical style knots. I made a ditty bag. I researched materials so that I have the right stuff. I used the right stuff. I got to sit down in a similar fashion as what they did for sail making. I got to demonstrate this for the public. I was able to put together new programming that I hadn't done before, learning skills that I'd never learned before. So even though it didn't turn out, it's all right. I took a chance. I made mistakes. I got messy, and I learned stuff along the way. And as a result of that, I'm a better interpreter, being able to work with the public, tell them about the history that I'm a steward of, that they might have a better understanding. And in the process, get to encourage you along the way as well. Take chances, make mistakes, get messy, guys. Don't worry if the final project doesn't turn out exactly the way that it was. Take the things that you learned and apply them to the next project, because you're still learning along the way. It's all right if you've got to set a project off to the side for a while. That's exactly what I'm doing with the keelboat sail. It's sitting 5 feet away from me right now in my classroom. But it's going to be all right, because that's part of what it takes when we're pursuing the craft. See, this was more than just learning about being a keelboat man. This was more than just learning about how to make that sail. This was me growing as an interpreter. This is me growing as a historian. This is us pursuing the craft of living history so that people can better understand history in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have learned about had they not come and learned from us, those that go to these lengths to do these things. So no matter what, guys, I just want to encourage you, no matter how frustrating it gets, keep on pursuing the craft. Give yourself permission to take chances, make mistakes, and getting messy. Have a good evening.